For months, the massive wreck of the Costa Concordia lay beached off the Mediterranean island of Giglio. The dramatic sight of epic rescues, grim recoveries, and the largest ship salvage ever undertaken. At 9:45 p.m. on the 13th of January 2012, the Costa Concordia cruise ship crashed into rocks as the captain was performing a sail-by salute near the Italian island of Giglio. In minutes, the ship was fatally disabled and beginning to sink, with more than 4,200 passengers and crew on board.
And the ship started moving very fast, and so we knew we were going to be underwater quick, and so we just started jumping, and there were 200 people that jumped and swam 100 meters to rocks, and we got up on the shore.
The Costa Concordia was just one of hundreds of luxury liners serving a multi-billion-dollar global industry for cruise vacations. For the first time, the whole story is revealed of the biggest rescue operation and ship salvage of all time. Passengers tell their harrowing stories, and experts reveal how more attention to sea safety might have prevented the disaster.
I am still in contact with lawyers because I gave a written deposition and I intend to give verbal testimony in court because I want to look those officers who left us all there in the eye.
That evening, Costa Concordia captain Francesco Schettino had ordered a deviation from his set course. The Costa Concordia was sailing too close to the coast and too fast. As the evening was getting underway for passengers, Captain Schettino ordered a series of right turns to try to avoid the rocks, but it was too late. A brisk 15-knot wind didn't help, slowing any quick maneuvers that might have changed its fatal course. Professor Sven Dresen of the Department of Maritime Studies at Wismar College in Rostock, Germany, used real data to recreate the accident. Inside the college's state-of-the-art ship simulator, he describes step by step what happened.
Anfänglich wurde ja dann über Autopilot 290 geordert. Im weiteren Verlauf wurde der Helmsman, also der Rudergänger.
At first, the autopilot was set at 290, and then the helmsman was called to take over manual steering, which is normal in this kind of situation.
Im weiteren Verlauf Steuerbord 20, also eine Steuerborddrehung des Schiffes vergrößert.
We continue with starboard 10, then starboard 20, and we have increased the starboard turn of the ship. We have tried to reproduce all the conditions of the time, the light conditions, cloud cover, and wind, which is very important because it was blowing from northeast. Then speed was increased to 16 knots.
The ship's bow cleared the rocks, but realizing the ship's peril, the captain ordered rudders to port to push the stern around them, but it was too late.
Dann versucht das Schiff natürlich sehr stark über Steuerbord zu drehen.
The idea was maybe that a hard turn to port would take the ship around close to the rock, but this was not done, and naturally, that's why it didn't work.
Natürlich genau deswegen nicht funktioniert.
Basta 5 metri dallo scoglio, c'è già
5 meters from the rocks, the water is 30 meters deep, and at 10 meters, that goes to 70 meters depth. The water is really deep, so if you hit a rock, it really means that you have come onto the island. You've crashed into the island. You haven't hit an underwater rock.
Ja, diese Situation hat sich oft dargestellt. Jetzt liegen wir auf Grund.
In fact, no one could have done anything. There were no possible operations that could have helped in this situation, or which could have avoided the accident.
Den knapp verfehlt, oder aber so wie hier liegt fest.
In just 20 seconds, all 6 electrodiesel engines were swamped by more than 2,000 tons of water. Water pushed upwards to the crew deck, where the electrical panel blew out, causing a blackout. When the Coast Guard called, following alarmed phone calls from passengers, Captain Schettino withheld key information.
Buonasera Costa Concordia, cortesemente avete dei problemi a bordo voi? Sì, affermativo, abbiamo un blackout a bordo e stiamo verificando le condizioni.
Enfin, il y a eu un problème majeur de communication.
And then there was a major problem of communications within the ship itself. Immediately after striking the reef, the passengers were told simply that the ship was subject to an electrical blackout, that the electric generator had broken down, and that once this breakdown had been repaired, passengers could return safely to their cabins.
Ou réparé, les gens pouvaient aisément retourner dans leur cabine.
They told us to just stay in the hallway, not to leave, but stay in the hallway, stay close, wait for everything was under control, that the generator had been broken, and that's why there was a blackout.
Please remain calm. The situation is under control.
With no power and rudders locked, the helpless ship was pushed back to shore by the wind. As the ship listed heavily, some lifeboats became undeployable. Passengers unable to get into lifeboats on the port side made their way down slippery corridors to the starboard side. When all the lifeboats there were launched, they had to go down to deck 3 to get into boats coming back and forth. Survivors described their ordeal just hours after the wreck.
There's water coming on board. There's something wrong if it's tipping like that. So I thought, I just want to get to the surface. But that was chaotic in the hallways, people with life jackets on, the power was out.
Akkor mi elkezdtünk rohanni, mentem le a harmadikra.
So we started running to get to the 3rd floor. But the ship was so tilted that we couldn't go down the regular way. When we got to the stairs, I fell and sprained my ankle and hurt my back. I didn't know then that I had a torn ligament. With great difficulties, I had to find my way to the back areas of the ship on the 3rd floor, and there I was able to jump into the last lifeboat so late that my foot was literally in the sea.
And we were up close. We didn't get on the first lifeboats, and then they were gone, and there we stood, and we made friends with some crew members, and they helped us kind of get around a little area and sneak down a Jacob's ladder.
Un certain nombre également de
Life rafts didn't open as they should, when they should open automatically when thrown into the sea. We have photographs and witness reports who say they didn't open.
Témoignages qui disent qu'elles ne se sont pas ouvertes.
At 20 past midnight, the ship began to capsize, trapping dozens of people in the upturned corridors and sucking some underwater. The island's brave deputy mayor boarded the sinking ship to rescue dozens, as Francesco Schettino abandoned them to their fate. Working with the few remaining crew, Mario Pellegrini pulled up survivors from corridors that had tilted over into well-like shafts.
Le operazioni sono andate avanti almeno per
These operations went on for an hour and a half because there were some that were easy to pull up, but others were heavy. The rope was very thin, and the hands, my hands, were all cut. The situation was dramatic and a bit tiring. The last ones had the rope around their waist only, out of hurry to be pulled up. They were completely wet with water. By then they were floating in the water because water had reached that level.
erano bagnati completamente di acqua, ormai galleggiavano nel mare, quindi l'acqua ormai gli era arrivata.
We were actually abandoning ship, so but they didn't have enough room on the boats for us, so we had to wait. They said they were coming back to get us, and at that point the boat started sinking more and more on the side we were at, and we made that decision at that point that we had to get off. And it's a good thing we did, because the part that is now underwater is where we were standing.
È questa? Guarda dov'è? Eccola qui. È affondata. Ok,
This was the sight that greeted the Coast Guard helicopter pilots, who immediately put a rescue diver onto the ship to winch dozens to safety. Hundreds had made it to the exposed hull for boat or helicopter rescue.
Il primo a salire a bordo è stato un aerosoccorritore.
The first to climb on board was a helicopter rescue man. Our helicopter rescue team members have specialized training. They come down from helicopters and descend on the accident site. This time, they descended onto the ship and gave first aid to the people who were trapped on the ship, terrorized and afraid.
Erano bloccate sulla nave, terrorizzate, spaventate.
Ich habe am nächsten Tag zwei Frauen getroffen, die sind bis 4 Uhr früh auf der
I met 2 women the next day who were there until 4 a.m., until a helicopter rescued them. I met a married couple from Austria, and she was 6 months pregnant, and they had jumped into the water. Thankfully, the baby survived. It was their honeymoon. They did not know if the baby would survive.
10 Meter Höhe. Zum Glück hat das Baby überlebt.
32 people had drowned in the waters around the ship and inside the flooded corridors and lift shafts. 3 days after the accident, hope for survivors was rapidly fading. But occasionally, miracles do happen.
Okay. Stop. Sit down and relax.
Desperately fleeing the capsizing ship, passengers massed on the Giglio quayside. Dramatic rescues were underway. After a freezing night in Giglio port, the 4,000 passengers and crew were sent back to Porto Santo Stefano. Newsweek reporter Barbie Latza-Nadeau was there when the survivors began to arrive.
We were here about 8:30, 8:45 in the morning, which is when the first ferries were coming in from Giglio, carrying passengers and crew members who were still wet, who were carrying the clothes, wearing the clothes and carrying some of their personal effects, their shoes. There was a woman who had been obviously at a formal dinner on the cruise who was carrying her high-heeled shoes, and her companion had his sort of tuxedo jacket with him. And well, there were a lot of people with minor injuries, with bruises, with blood on them, but most of the people were just freezing.
On Giglio, it was a desperate race against time to save those who were trapped alive.
I 2 coreani sono stati.
The 2 Koreans were identified around midnight, and they were at the end of a corridor that had become like a well due to the way the ship was tilting. That's the way it looked. And we heard their voices inside one of the cabins in the dry part of the ship.
Di cui sono state sentite le voci all'interno di una delle cabine nella parte ancora emersa.
Cave divers worked underwater together with climbing teams on the dry parts of the ship to extract them.
Okay. Last step. Occhio piano. Okay.
Incredibly, South Korean school teachers Han Ki-deok and his wife, Jae-hong Hae-jin, had slept through the impact and were trapped in their cabin on deck 8 as water rushed in.
Injury? No.
No injury?
No.
Okay. Pronto, via! Vai! Pronti, via! Vai! Pronti, via! Vai! Vai, ultimo sforzo. No, se no, fermo, va fuori forte. Allenta! Molla.
They survived on biscuits and water, clinging to their bed as the sea lapped at their cabin.
It was really amazing because, this was 3 days after the actual crash, and nobody had really expected to find any survivors. And then there was a diver who came into the coffee bar where all the journalists were working and said they found someone alive. And we all sort of ran out, and we were watching as they took this helicopter and pulled out these 2 South Korean honeymooners and brought them to the shore, and then took them by helicopter again to Grosseto.
The purser was found alive in the dining room, lying on a table with a broken leg. But dozens were still missing, including the ship's violinist, Sándor Fehér, and Mylène and Michael, a young French couple on a romantic getaway. Their families weren't losing hope.
On a su qu'il y avait des bus qui étaient avec des rescapés qui devaient arriver à Marseille.
We heard that there were buses coming into Marseille every hour with survivors, so we began calling the crisis centre in Marseille. We called every time a bus arrived to have news, to find out if our kids were on that bus. They told us they were aboard a bus, but unfortunately we called until Sunday at 1 a.m. and we had no news of the children. No one had arrived in Marseille.
Ils étaient à bord d'un autocar. Et malheureusement, on a appelé jusqu'au dimanche 1h du matin et on n'a pas eu de nouvelles des enfants. Personne n'était arrivé à Marseille.
When we went to Rome to search for him, well, at first we went there to find him. I brought 100 posters with his picture to put up for display on the island itself. Because if he survived the accident by swimming ashore, he might have been given shelter somewhere. So when we went there, we were thinking that he must be alive and well, and that we were sure to find him.
The next time Thérèse Feher saw her son was at the morgue. Mylène and Michael's families would have to wait weeks before divers located their children's bodies, identified by DNA samples. It was a grueling task for divers who had to explore every corner of the ship, inside and out. This Fire Brigade cave diving unit trains in treacherous inland waters of caves, grottos and rivers to prepare for tough, murky conditions like those in the Costa Concordia. Carlo Zelinotti commanded a Fire Brigade unit specialized in hazardous cave diving. The team carried extra air bottles and long cords so as not to get lost in the maze of submerged corridors.
This is not a job where you can afford to be reluctant to face scenes that can at times be spine-chilling.
Quando abbiamo iniziato le penetrazioni ci siamo accorti immediatamente dei pericoli.
When we started our penetrations, we realized immediately the dangers that our exploration of the ship would expose us to. Doors were tilted downwards, so tended to close. So we had to make sure they were blocked, because as the diver passed, even if they were open, they might have closed, trapping the diver inside.
Aperte immediatamente dopo potevano richiudersi e quindi bloccarlo all'interno.
Navy assault troops blew out the windows to give divers safer access. As the Costa Concordia's water grew more toxic, divers had to completely isolate their bodies from the pollutants and use helmets with compressed air piped in from the surface.
Perché sapevamo benissimo che all'interno della nave erano presenti in grande quantità.
We knew that there were large quantities. Considering the many passengers and travelers aboard, large quantities of chemical substances and oils. For this reason, we used the surface supply system with the helmets, which protected the divers at least in the more dangerous search operations.
Nelle fasi di ispezione evidentemente un po' più pericolose.
The Coast Guard and Fire Brigade Command Center on Giglio Port was the search and rescue hub. It was here where divers decontaminated from the pollutants they swam in daily. To explore the dark waters around the ship, special units deployed remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, which were guided to objects of interest using ultrasound sensors called Scouts. The remote search is managed via computers on the surface.
Questa attrezzatura ci permette di perlustrare.
This equipment allows us to explore the seafloor and gather data with regards to targets. Once the map of the seafloor has been made, we start working with the ROV, lowering this machine here. Once the ROV is in the water, it is traced by the Scout, So the ROV operator and the scout operator coordinate with each other and inspect the targets we have selected using the side scan sonar.
Scelto prima con il sistema side scan sonar.
As some died in Concordia's sunken corridors, 1,000 passengers had to slide down the slippery outer hull into rescue boats. It took nearly 6 hours. The official court report on the accident faults both the captain and the cruise company, noting neither ordered an immediate evacuation. Lack of a common language and poor training also played a role. Jan Hassem and his toddler son Halvor survived the Scandinavian Star ferry disaster in 1990. His pregnant wife Christine, however, perished along with 158 others. Today, he and Marine Accident Inspector Arne Sagen lobby for sea safety on behalf of the Norwegian Skagerrak Foundation. The foundation maintains the Costa Concordia disaster reflects larger industry problems, such as a disregard for maritime laws and lack of accountability when accidents happen.
The ship strayed from the route it was supposed to take. The ship sailed in waters where there were shallows they were not aware of and not prepared to manage, even though they could have been. So it was an unnecessary accident.
Første informasjonen vi fikk var at skipet hadde en kaptein som var alkoholiker, kvinnejeger og inkompetent.
The first information we got was that the ship's captain was an alcoholic, a womanizer, and incompetent, according to the shipping company's spokesperson. Then my first thought was, who in the world would hire that man as a captain? That showed that the captain was missing the necessary support and backup from the shipping company, which is the first requirement to do a proper job.
Men det også noe som gjennomgående, noe som generelt, og det jo...
One thing recurring in general is the missing safety culture. That existing laws, regulations and conventions are not well implemented in the industry. We see elements of what has happened on the world's oceans that fit the stereotype of the old Wild West.
Stereotypen fra det gamle Wild West.
If the ship had capsized out at sea, the death toll would have been far higher. While 3,000 got off on lifeboats and tenders going back and forth from ship to port, another 1,000 were rescued off the side of the ship's hull hours later.
You know, this industry has continued to just grow bigger and bigger and bigger. Costa Concordia is not even the largest ship. The largest ship is a 6,000 passenger vessel. The problem here is that these ships are top-heavy. They do this for profit because they know that they can sell a balcony space for much more than they can sell space under or below the waterline. The second problem with these ships is that they are created, designed to keep you shopping on board, to keep you gambling on board, to keep you entertained and using the inside of the vessel. And so it becomes a labyrinth in an accident. These ships become a trap.
On the 15th of February, divers found 5 bodies in the stern of Deck 4. Immediately recognizable was Diana Arlotti, just 5 years old. They had been only minutes from rescue. The final death toll was 32. Now, the race was on to save the island from a potential environmental catastrophe. The island of Giglio is one of Italy's beauty spots, with unique flora and fauna along its rocky coastline. First, the Costa Concordia trapped dozens of passengers and crew inside it. But now, it was also threatening to kill this fragile marine ecosystem.
The negative impact is in front of the eyes of everyone. We have a ship sunken right off the coast of Giglio. The impact was not just an emotional one due to the example given by all the island residents whose behavior was impeccable, but also a material impact that we won't be able to see in its entirety until this operation is complete and the ship has been taken away from Giglio.
Costa called in a Dutch company specialized in heavy oil removal. Smit is one of the world's leading salvage companies and made headlines when it helped raise the Kursk nuclear submarine from the Barents Sea. They hired a local company for support. The Neri family has been in the Italian ship salvage industry for nearly a century.
L'immagine era un'immagine surreale, quasi impossibile da immaginare.
The picture was surreal, almost impossible to imagine. The sight filled me with sadness, and to see the body of the ship like that was really dreadful. The level of risk was high because we didn't know how stable the ship was, nor did we know how solid the ship itself was, nor whether it was going to slip to the sea floor, and whether the rocky shelf would support the ship.
Draining the oil from the cold, sunken ship was a hard task.
Het systeem wat we hebben gebruikt voor het verpompen van de olie.
To pump the oil, we use a system called hot tapping. This technique involves 2 stages.
First, a template is attached to the steel hull and 4 drill studs are inserted. Then the flanged mill head is bolted on. The circular saw cuts into the hull. The flange is sealed. Pipes are attached. Now oil can be pumped out.
Nou, omdat het schip een behoorlijke slagzij had en nog steeds heeft over stuurboord.
The starboard tanks were underwater. This meant we had to make a hole in the side of the ship to allow the divers and their equipment in. The hole was made in the double bottom, an empty space near the tanks. The double hole was very narrow, about 1.4 meters if I remember correctly. As you can see, this piece alone is more than a meter long. It is therefore very hard to handle the equipment and position it correctly.
Om dit dan te manoeuvreren en om dat dan nog in de hoogste en in de juiste stand te krijgen, dat is erg moeilijk.
Bulky suits and helmets hampered the divers.
We gebruiken altijd de Kirby Morgan duikhelm.
We always use the Kirby Morgan helmet with an umbilical cable. The umbilical carries the air the diver is breathing, but also contains the power feed for the video camera and the diving light mounted on the helmet. This is a helmet used by our divers. I have to say it weighs a lot. In the water, it becomes a bit lighter, but the equipment used by the divers is very heavy, and with all this weight, they have to work in the most difficult situations.
Een enorme hoeveelheid aan gewicht wat ze onder water mee moeten dragen. En waar onder die omstandigheden moeten ze...
Removing the whole ship would take more than a year, but by mid-April, the oil removal job was done. The islanders had grown attached to the men and women who had come to save their shores from a possible environmental catastrophe.
E allora erano contenti poi alla sera questi olandesi
In the evenings in February and March, the big Dutch workers sat at bars with their orange overalls, big and blonde, drinking beer, and the old people would say, "Well done," because you have done a good job there. That's Giglio. That's the way they are. When they see people working, they are happy. Sorry, I get emotional.
Sì, il momento della partenza è stato un momento molto particolare per tutti noi.
The moment of departure was a very special moment for all of us, and for the operators who were leaving, because most of the people of the port came down to the quayside, waving flags and tablecloths and sheets from the windows, honking the car horns. It was a moving moment, a reciprocal exchange of thanks between the islanders and us.
Di reciproco scambio di gratitudine tra l'isola e noi.
In January, Carnival awarded the contract for removing the ship intact to Florida giant Titan, paired with small Italian company Micoperi. It was a massive job worth $450 million.
Però l'esigenza della tutela ambientale ha imposto un recupero.
The need to protect the environment requires the ship to be kept intact. As a result, we know the ship is now stabilized and held back and embraced by steel cables that hold her steady and stop her from sinking to the bottom. Then the ship will be righted and refloated and then moved, taken away to another place.
Il pericolo che possa scendere verso il fondo e questa nave dovrà essere raddrizzata per poi trovarsi in posizione di galleggiamento ed essere trasferita, portata via in un altro luogo.
Titan called in world-renowned salvage master Nick Sloan. It is the biggest and most complex salvage of his career.
Yeah, this is basically everything you've ever done before put together, but then extrapolated for the size. I mean, she is huge. She is almost three rugby fields, football fields long. The platforms we're going to put underneath, each one weighs 1,000 tons. They'll be bigger than a football field. So everything is just completely bigger than ever before.
The ship lies close to the shore, but just a few meters from an underwater cliff. It is balancing precariously on two small granite outcrops that cause the steel to bend in the middle, weakening the hull and threatening to break it in two. Giovanni Ceccarelli is a marine engineer who designed the America's Cup contender Mascalzone Latino. With Micoperi, an Italian company specialized in gas and oil platforms, he hatched the revolutionary plan for removing the massive ship in one piece.
La nave pesa 45.000 tonnellate.
The ship weighs 45,000 tons, and today, with the water in it and with the equipment on it, it will weigh around 60,000 tons. We have to remove and therefore rotate 60,000 tons and rotate it from 65 degrees list to the vertical.
Verticale, quindi capite già I numeri che ci sono.
There are 4 phases: stabilizing and anchoring the ship, pulling it upright, attaching ballast tanks so it will float, and towing it away. The project hinges on the amazing lifting power of hydraulic pulleys known as strand jacks. Workers first stabilized the ship with steel cables and strand jacks attached to concrete blocks anchored to the sea floor. To do this, divers used heavy machinery and giant drills to bore 16 meters into the granite rock to install 12 anchor blocks. Chains are attached on one side to these concrete blocks and pass under the hull to the other 48 strand jacks fixed to the ship. This harness keeps the ship from slipping over the precipice and will be used to right it when all the pieces are in place.
The idea is we're going to roll her upright and then add buoyancy around her to refloat her. Because of the bottom subsea profile of the rock, it's very similar to the mountain. It carries on underneath her. If we rolled her upright without having a platform, she would keep on rolling and disappear.
The second phase involves attaching massive ballast tanks filled with water, called sponsons, to the exposed side of the ship. It will then be rotated to the vertical using the weight of the tanks, and even more strand jacks attached via cables and chains to steel platforms, tailor-made as a cradle for the Costa Concordia. To be certain she doesn't slip down into the sea, 100 divers are building a concrete retaining wall beneath the ship's hull.
Then we add the buoyancy to the port side and the beddy lines underneath her. by the time the platform's on place. And then use pulling machines, hydraulic pulling machines, to roll her onto the platform. And we bring the buoyancy onto the starboard side and refloat her.
Once righted, ballast tanks will be attached to the other side. The hope is that when the ballast tanks are emptied, the ship will float. Even if it does, that won't be the end of Costa Cruises' troubles. Nearly a year after the Costa Concordia sank off the Italian island of Giglio, the immediate tragedy has passed, but a huge task remains: the world's largest ship salvage. Workers toil night and day to stabilize the ship, as winter storms threaten to sink it once and for all.
Every wave that breaks against the ship does something to it. As a result, it is getting weaker. The submerged part of the ship is very badly damaged, and every day they monitor the cuts and breakages that the ship may have, and we try to keep abreast of all these elements in our planning. Like a patient who is sick, we constantly carry out analysis.
The ship is deteriorating, but there are other obstacles too. Beneath the sandy sea floor lies a layer of granite.
On the offshore side, that's the large diameter drilling, and obviously because of the angle of the slope, it's very difficult to get the drill to bite into the granite. Granite is the hardest rock to drill into, so it's twice as hard as limestone or sandstone, and that with the angle gives us problems as well.
As dawn rises over the island, a huge floating accommodation platform is being towed into place, with lodging for over 100 salvage divers who risk their lives every day.
So we're ready for trauma, we're ready for diving accidents, but obviously when you're talking about big shackles, big chains and the angles, then crushed fingers, you're going to get those type of injuries. With 450 people, you can expect one injury a week, so we don't want to have any serious injuries. At the end of the operation, everyone has to go home in one piece.
But as autumn turned to winter, delays had already begun to set back the long salvage. 1 year has passed and the ship has only just been stabilized.
Diciamo che la figura generale del progetto è rimasta la stessa.
Let's say that the overall principle of the project is the same, but it has changed where recalculations were necessary to develop the design premises. This has led to a delay in the work because we had to stop a moment to recalculate in order to guarantee the safety of the task underway. So, rather than a delay, I would call it a tuning. The platforms themselves, according to the changes in our calculations after we had moved the anchor blocks and had to move the position of the platforms, well, these changed in number and type.
Spostando le piattaforme cambiavano sia in numero che tipologia.
We're building buoyancy tanks, so those buoyancy tanks, each one's 11 stories high. The larger ones are over 500 tons each, and the platforms and the sponsons together, we've got over 23,000 tons of steel being fabricated around Italy. So it's 5 shipyards plus 3 fabrication facilities. And that on its own is quite a logistical operation.
Islanders worry the troubled project could drag on into next summer's tourist season.
Yes, the ship is there. Yes, that's true. And we have all done what we had to do. We can be proud of ourselves, but enough is enough. The sooner it is removed, the better. That's the idea.
Then, perhaps, survivors can begin to find closure. Many still suffer anxiety from the accident.
A number of passengers saw people die after jumping into the sea from the 5th or 6th deck, and who came up as lifeless bodies. There were those who were blocked in lifts or in corridors. A number of survivors heard people scream as they died. There are as many individual situations as survivors. This anxiety, these situations cause post-traumatic stress that is very strong.
Des conséquences post-traumatiques qui sont extrêmement importantes.
The woman who was in the lifeboat who that fell basically after it had been suspended on the upper side of the ship was describing how she saw a body in the water. She didn't know at that time if the person could have been saved. She wanted to go back. It was dark. It was by then they were experiencing a lot of trauma and shock, but she said she thinks about it every day.
But Costa and their parent company, Carnival Cruise Lines, have not treated all survivors equally.
We were conferring with Costa all along. The meeting was arranged to take place at my lawyer's office. We were all sitting there, and their lawyer didn't show up. We were only told at the last minute that he called off coming here, that Costa was not willing to negotiate with us.
Nem akar velünk tárgyalni.
To force the company to the bargaining table, lawyers in France and the US threatened to have their ships seized in the port of Marseille and the Gulf of Mexico. In this exclusive film, US Marshals serve a court order on a ship's captain in Galveston, Texas.
All right, sir, we're here to execute a court order. We're seizing this vessel.
When you step on one of these Carnival Cruise Lines, when you pass the gangplank, you have left your country behind. You have stepped into a new country, and I call it the nation of Carnival.
Január ótától, mikor hazajöttünk rá.
2 weeks after we came home in January, we received 458 euros. 9 months have passed since, but Costa is not taking any notice of us. We haven't received our wages. They paid nothing for our lost gear and instruments.
Well, we intend to prove that the captain was negligent, which of course he was, but we're also going to prove that the cruise companies were negligent, grossly negligent, in that they did not train the people properly, the crew members. No one died in the actual collision. It was the aftermath that people died in.
On voudrait absolument que le commandant et une partie.
We want to see the commander and some of his officers in prison for the wrong they have done. They have killed 32 people, including our children, and destroyed the lives of dozens of people. Justice needs to be done. It has broken our lives and the lives of Michael's parents and Milene's brother's life. It's hard to say, but justice needs to be done.
1 year has passed since 32 people died in the wreck of the Costa Concordia. Sometime in 2013, the ship is expected to be towed away, and the captain, officers, and owners will stand trial. But the island will never be the same. Below the rock that sank the massive ship lies a statue of the Madonna, where divers lay wreaths of flowers to honor victims of the sea. Innocents betrayed by machine and man.